My mother threw my belongings into the hallway on a Tuesday morning. 3 bags. The kind you use for donations. She didn't even use boxes. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I picked up all 3 bags, walked to the elevator, and pressed the button for the lobby. What my mother did not know was that the man whose name was on her lease, the one she called every Christmas to wish a happy holiday, the one she bragged about to her friends at the country club, answered to me. She had handed me the reason to buy his company. And I did. Before I continue, drop a comment and let me know where you are watching from. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been thrown away by someone who should have been your safe place and had to build your entire life back in silence. My name is Gabrielle Ward. I am 32 years old. And the story I am about to tell you did not start the morning my mother threw me out. It started much earlier than that, in the particular silence of a household that had 2 sets of rules. Depending on which child you were, Preston got the rules that bent. I got the ones that didn't. My brother is 4 years older than me. Growing up in Stamford, Connecticut, in a house with cathedral ceilings and a 3-car garage, you would think there was enough for everyone. Enough attention, enough grace, enough room to fail once without it being used against you for the next decade. But my mother, Diane Ward, did not operate that way, not with me, with Preston. Failure was a phase, a stepping stone, something to reframe over Sunday dinner with a glass of Chardonnay and a laugh. With me, failure was evidence. It confirmed whatever she already suspected, that I was the difficult one, the ungrateful one, the one who thought she was better than everyone else, simply because I asked questions and kept receipts. I kept receipts because I had learned to. My father, Charles Ward, was a quiet man. He worked in structured finance for 31 years, drove the same Volvo for a decade, and never once raised his voice in our house. He and my mother were not a love story by the time I was old enough to understand what love stories look like. They were arrangement, functional, polite, occasionally warm. He loved us. I knew that without him ever having to perform it. He showed up to every school event I had, sat in the back so he wouldn't make me nervous, and always had a specific thing to say afterward. Not, "Great job," something real. Something he had actually watched. He died of a cardiac event 11 days after my 26th birthday. I was living in New York at the time, working my first analyst position at a mid-size investment firm in Midtown. I got the call at 6:47 in the morning and drove to Stamford in clothes I had slept in. My mother was already composed by the time I arrived. Preston was sitting at the kitchen island eating toast. That was the day I understood that grief, in our family, was also subject to the 2 sets of rules. Preston got to be devastated. I was expected to be useful. I handled the arrangements. I called the extended family. I sat with the funeral director for 2 hours going over details while my mother rested upstairs. I did not cry in front of anyone for 11 days, and when I finally did, alone, in my childhood bedroom at 2 in the morning, my mother knocked on the door, opened it without waiting, looked at me, and said, "I hope you're not going to make this harder than it already is." I was 26 years old. I went back to New York 3 days after the funeral, and I buried myself in work the way my father had taught me. Not to escape, but to build. I got my MBA at night while working full-time. I moved firms twice, each time for a better title and a sharper team. By 29, I was a senior analyst at a private equity fund based in Greenwich, 40 minutes from the house I grew up in, and I was good at my job in the specific way that people who have always had to prove themselves are good at things, thoroughly, quietly, without fanfare. I did not talk about my family at work. I did not talk about Stamford or the house with the cathedral ceilings. I had an apartment in Norwalk I had furnished slowly, piece by piece, and a small circle of friends who knew me as someone steady and composed. That was the version of myself I had worked hardest to build. Not the daughter. Not the difficult one. Just Gabrielle, who knew how to read a balance sheet and showed up on time and never made things harder than they already were. My mother called once a month, on the first Sunday. The calls lasted between 12 and 18 minutes. She told me what Preston was doing. A new venture, a new contact, a new idea that was surely going to be the one that finally worked. She told me about her friends, the country club, the renovation she was doing on the kitchen of the penthouse she'd moved into 2 years after my father passed. She asked me general questions about work, not specific ones, because the specifics required a kind of sustained attention she did not extend to me. I answered. I kept my voice even. I hung up and went back to whatever I had been doing. It was not a warm relationship, but it was a stable one. And I had learned somewhere in my late 20s that stable was not nothing. I did not know. during those monthly calls, that my father had left me something. I did not know because his attorney, a careful, old-fashioned man named Gerald Fitch, who had handled my father's affairs for 20 years, had been instructed to wait. To wait until I was settled, my father had written. Until she is somewhere solid and has the sense to use it well. Gerald Fitch called me on a Thursday afternoon in October, 2 years after I had been thrown out of my mother's penthouse. But I am getting ahead of myself before any of that, before Gerald, before Harwick Capital Group. Before the morning I walked into a boardroom in Greenwich and watched my mother's face go the color of copy paper. There was the layoff. And the layoff started everything. The layoff was not personal. That is what the HR director told me, and I believe she meant it as comfort. Though it landed the way those things always land. Like being told the car that hit you wasn't aiming for you specifically, it was March. The fund had been absorbing losses from 2 portfolio companies that had overextended through the back half of the previous year, and the managing partners made the decision to reduce headcount by 30% across the analyst and associate levels. I was given the news on a Wednesday at 4 in the afternoon in a glass-walled conference room with a box of tissues on the table that I did not touch. I was told I had 2 weeks. My severance was 12 weeks of base salary. The HR director slid a folder across the table and said my contributions had been valued. She said it the way people say things they are required to say. I walked back to my desk, finished the memo I had been writing before the meeting, sent it to the team lead, packed my personal items into my bag, a framed photo of my father, a spare phone charger, a coffee mug I had bought in Portland 2 summers ago, and left the building at 4:47 in the afternoon. I sat in my car in the parking structure for 9 minutes. Not crying, just sitting. Doing the math the way my father had taught me. Inventory first, then options. I had 4 months of expenses and savings. I had skills that were transferable. I had a network, modest but real. The situation was difficult. It was not unsurvivable. What I did not calculate, sitting in that parking structure, was my mother. I should have. I had 27 years of data. I called her that evening from my apartment. I told her calmly, in the same tone I used for everything, that I had been laid off as part of a firm-wide reduction, that I had severance, that I was already thinking through next steps. I was not calling for money. I was not calling for rescue. I think, if I am honest with myself now, I was calling because she was my mother, and I had just had a hard day, and some part of me, some small, stubborn, foolish part, still believed that information mattered, that if I told her something true about my life, she would respond to the truth of it. She was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then she said, "Well, I hope you've been saving." I told her I had. She said she hoped I wasn't going to let this set me back. I said I wasn't planning on it. Then she said, "You know, if you had stayed closer to home, built something here instead of running off to New York and Greenwich, you wouldn't be starting over at your age." I was 31 years old. She said, "Your age," the way she might have said, "your condition." I said goodnight and hung up. 3 days later, my landlord, a man I had rented from without incident for 2.5 years, sent me a notice that the building had been sold and all month-to-month leases would not be renewed. I had 60 days. I cannot explain the particular exhaustion of having 2 bad things happen in the same week. Not devastation, I want to be precise here. It was not devastation. It was the specific weight of having to recalculate everything at once, while also continuing to function, while also not allowing anyone to see that you were recalculating. I called my mother on Saturday morning. I told her about the lease. I told her I needed somewhere to stay for a few weeks while I found a new apartment, that I had the money, that I just needed a landing place while the next one came together. Her penthouse had 3 bedrooms. She lived alone. She said she would think about it and call me back. She called back Sunday evening and said yes. I packed what I needed into 4 bags, put the rest in storage, and drove to Stamford on a Monday. I want you to understand that I did not show up empty-handed or without a plan. I brought groceries the first day. I offered to cover whatever utilities I added. I stayed out of her way. I kept my things in the guest room, made my calls from there, spent my days applying for positions and reaching out to former colleagues, and doing exactly what a person with a plan does. For 11 days, it was fine. On the 12th day, Diane had people over. It was a Tuesday. I did not know she had invited anyone. She had not mentioned it. I came out of the guest room at noon to make lunch and found 4 women I recognized from her country club circle, arranged in the living room with mimosas and a charcuterie board. Her friend Rosemary. Her friend Judith. A woman named Carol who had once told me at a Christmas party that I looked severe, and Sandra, whose husband Richard owned a property management company that handled, among other things, the building my mother lived in. I said hello. I tried to move through the kitchen quickly. I was wearing what I had been working in, a clean shirt, jeans, nothing remarkable, and I had not been expecting an audience. My mother looked at me from across the room with an expression I had spent my entire life learning to read. It was the expression she wore when I was an embarrassment that had arrived without calling ahead. She said, "Gabrielle is staying with me for a bit." She lost her job, not was laid off, not is in transition. Lost her job, the way you lose a set of keys through carelessness, through not paying attention. Rosemary made a sympathetic sound. Carol looked at me over her glass. Sandra said nothing, but she looked at my mother in a way that passed something between them I was not meant to see. I said, I was laid off in a firm-wide reduction. I'm interviewing. I kept my voice level. I held my plate, my mother said. She's always been the type to land on her feet. Eventually, the word eventually sat in the room like something spilled. I finished making my lunch. I went back to the guest room. I closed the door. I heard them for the next 2 hours, the particular pitch of women laughing at something they find mutually satisfying. I sat at the small desk by the window and kept working. I sent 3 follow-up emails. I reviewed a job description for a position in New Haven. I did not allow myself to feel what I was feeling until I had finished everything on my list, because that was the only way I knew how to survive a room like the one I had just walked out of. At 3:15, the guests left. At 3:22, my mother knocked on the guest room door. She opened it before I could answer. She stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and said, "This isn't working." I looked up from my laptop. She said, "I need my space back." "I think you should find somewhere else," I said. "I've been here 12 days, she said. "I know how long you've been here, Gabrielle." I said, "I just need a few more weeks." "I have the money for a deposit I just need," she said. "I'm not doing this." She walked out of the doorway, down the hall, and I heard her bedroom door close. I sat at the desk for 4 minutes. Then I got up, folded my clothes back into the 4 bags I had arrived with, carried them one by one to the front hallway, and set them by the door. My mother did not come out of her bedroom. I picked up my bags, took the elevator to the lobby, put everything in my car, and drove away from the building. I did not look up at her floor. I knew she wasn't watching. What I did not know, what I could not have known yet, was that the building I had just driven away from, the one with Richard Calloway's name on the management contract, and Sandra's easy smile and my mother's mimosas on a Tuesday afternoon, was going to become the most important piece of real estate in my life. Not because I would ever live there again, because of what I was about to discover I already owned. I spent that first night at a Marriott off I-95 in Norwalk. It was not a bad hotel. Clean room, decent bed, a desk with adequate lighting. I ordered room service, a club sandwich and a pot of coffee, and sat with my laptop open and my 4 bags stacked against the wall, and I made a list. That is what I do when the ground moves. I make lists. My father used to say that a written list is just panic with structure, and structure is always better than panic, so you might as well start there. The list had 3 columns. What I had, what I needed, what I was going to do next, what I had. 12 weeks of severance, 4 months of savings beyond that, a car that was paid off, a storage unit with the rest of my furniture, and a professional network I had spent 6 years building with deliberate care. What I needed: a short-term furnished apartment, a new position inside 90 days, and enough distance from the last 72 hours to think clearly. What I was going to do next: find the apartment in the morning, send 5 targeted outreach messages before noon, and not call my mother back if she called. She didn't call. I found a furnished studio in Norwalk within a week, a quiet building 2 blocks from the water, 3rd floor, good light. It cost more per month than I wanted to spend, but it was clean and it had a proper desk, and the landlord was a retired school teacher named Hector, who asked for first month and a deposit and did not ask me anything else. I moved in on a Friday, and by Saturday morning I had my laptop set up, and my father's photograph on the desk, and a grocery run done, and I was in every practical sense functional. Functional was what I aimed for. Not happy, not settled, functional. Functional meant I could keep moving, and moving was the only thing that had ever reliably gotten me through anything. The job search was slower than I had expected. Not because I wasn't qualified. I was, and I knew it. But because the market that spring was tight in a way that had nothing to do with individual merit and everything to do with timing. 3 firms I reached out to were in the middle of their own restructurings. 2 positions I applied for were eliminated before the second round interviews. I had conversations that went well and then went quiet. I kept my pipeline moving. I did not allow myself to interpret silence as rejection until it was confirmed. My mother texted me once, 3 weeks after I left. It said, "I hope you're settled somewhere. No question mark." Not, "Are you settled?" Just a statement, as though she were narrating something she had already decided was true. I did not respond. Preston called me once, a month in. I almost didn't answer. I picked up because I thought, in the way that you sometimes think things you know are probably wrong, that maybe he was calling to say something true. That maybe the version of my brother, who had sat at the kitchen island eating toast the morning our father died, had been replaced, even briefly, by someone with a more accurate understanding of what had happened and what it had cost me. He called to tell me that my mother was upset, that I was being cold, that family was family, and whatever had happened, I needed to remember that. I asked him where he was when she put my bags in the hallway. He said that wasn't fair. I said I knew. And I hung up. The call with Gerald Fitch came on a Thursday in late October, 7 weeks after I had moved into the Norwalk studio. I was eating breakfast when my phone rang. A 203 area code I didn't recognize, which meant Connecticut, which made me hesitate for exactly 1 second before I answered. Gerald introduced himself as the attorney who had handled my father's estate. He had a careful, measured voice, the kind that belongs to men who have delivered significant news for a long time and have learned to pace it. He told me he had been trying to reach me at an old address, that my father had left instructions for him to wait until a specific period had elapsed and certain conditions had been met in terms of my stability and professional standing before making contact. I set down my fork. Gerald said my father had established a trust in my name. He said the trust held liquid assets totaling $2.3 million. He said there was also a separate investment portfolio, modest, conservatively managed, that had been quietly appreciating for 6 years. And he said my father had left a handwritten letter sealed with my name on the envelope. I did not say anything for a long moment. Gerald asked if I was still there. I said yes. I said I was there. He asked if I could come to his office in Stamford. I drove to Stamford the following Monday. Gerald's office was on the 4th floor of a building on Atlantic Street. Dark wood, framed diplomas, the particular stillness of a room where consequential things are handled without drama. He was in his late 60s, silver-haired, the kind of man who shook your hand with both of his and meant it. He had known my father for more than 20 years. He looked at me across the desk, the way people look at you when they have been waiting to tell you something important and are relieved, finally, to say it. He walked me through the trust documentation first. The $2.3 million was structured to transfer to me in full upon my 30th birthday. But only if I was financially independent, which Gerald had confirmed by reviewing my employment records and tax filings before calling. The portfolio was separate, already in my name, requiring only my signature to activate management access. Then he handed me the letter. I opened it there, in the chair across from Gerald's desk, with the afternoon light coming through the blinds in long, even stripes. My father's handwriting was small and precise, the way engineers write. Each letter formed with intention, nothing wasted. The letter was 2 pages. I am not going to tell you everything it said, some of it belongs only to me. But the line I have thought about most, the line I come back to again and again when I need to remember why I did what I did in the months that followed, was near the bottom of the first page. He wrote, "Don't let them spend you down to nothing. You were always the one who knew what things were actually worth." I folded the letter and put it in my bag. I shook Gerald's hand. I thanked him. I drove back to Norwalk, and I sat at my desk, and I looked out at the water, and I thought about my father for a long time, and then I opened my laptop and I started working, not on job applications, on something else entirely. I had spent 6 years in private equity. I knew how to read a capital structure. I knew how to find a company that was underleveraged, undervalued, quietly struggling in ways its principals hadn't yet admitted to themselves. I knew how to move carefully, and how to move without announcing the movement. I had $2.3 million, and a portfolio, and a father who had believed I knew what things were worth. I had nothing to prove to anyone in particular. I want to be honest about that. This was not about my mother. Not yet. It was about building something real, something that could not be thrown into a hallway in 3 bags and left for me to carry to an elevator. It was during that research, 3 weeks in, cross-referencing Connecticut-based real estate holding companies with publicly available financial disclosures, that I first found the name Harwick Capital Group, and when I looked at who they owned and what they managed and whose buildings sat inside their portfolio, I sat back in my chair and I read the page again. Then I read it a third time. Then I reached for my phone and I called Gerald Fitch. Gerald answered on the second ring, the way he always did, as though he had been expecting the call. As though he had learned long ago that the people who mattered called when they had found something. I told him I had been looking at Harwick Capital Group. There was a brief pause. Then he said, "Your father looked at them too." I set down my coffee. Gerald explained it carefully. In the measured way he explained everything. My father had identified Harwick Capital Group 6 years before he died. A mid-sized Connecticut real estate holding company with a portfolio of 43 commercial and residential properties across Fairfield County. Privately held, family-controlled, conservatively managed by a man named Douglas Harwick, who had built the company over 30 years and had no children and no succession plan. My father had considered a position, but had not moved on it before he got sick. He had noted it in a memo he left with Gerald, attached to the trust documentation, flagged simply as, "Worth watching." Gabrielle will know what to do with it if the time comes. I read the memo that afternoon, scanned and emailed to me by Gerald's assistant. 3 pages, single-spaced, in my father's precise handwriting, rendered into typed text. He had analyzed Harwick the way he analyzed everything, systematically, without sentiment, with a clarity that made me understand, not for the first time, where I had gotten it from. The picture that emerged over the following 2 weeks, as I built my own analysis on top of his, was one I recognized immediately. Harwick Capital Group was a company in the particular kind of distress that doesn't announce itself loudly. It wasn't failing. It was stalling, and stalling, in real estate holding, is a slow bleed that eventually becomes a crisis if no one intervenes. Douglas Harwick was 71 years old. His 2 senior managers had both departed in the previous 18 months. The company's debt structure had been refinanced twice in 4 years at increasingly unfavorable terms. Their portfolio was solid, the underlying assets were genuinely good. But the operational layer above those assets was thin and getting thinner, most relevantly. Douglas Harwick needed liquidity. Not desperately, not yet, but the trajectory was clear to anyone who knew how to read it. I knew how to read it. I spent the first 2 weeks building the model. Revenue by property, debt service obligations, projected maintenance costs, vacancy trends across the portfolio. I stress-tested 3 scenarios, conservative, base, and optimistic, and in all 3, the underlying asset value significantly exceeded the company's current implied valuation. The portfolio was worth more than the market was giving it credit for, because the market was pricing in the operational weakness at the top. Fix the top, and the numbers changed considerably. I had $2.3 million. The trust also allowed for leveraged investment. Gerald confirmed this with the trust documentation, which meant I could use the liquid assets as a base and finance the rest. The math was tight, but it worked. 49% of Harwick Capital Group could be acquired in a structured deal for approximately $2.1 million, with the remaining funded through a private credit facility Gerald helped me arrange through a bank my father had worked with for years. Majority control, 51%, would require a second tranche contingent on Douglas Harwick's willingness to negotiate further. I called Gerald on a Tuesday evening after I had run the model for the 4th time and was satisfied that I had not made an error. I said, "I want to make an approach," Gerald said. "I thought you might." Douglas Harwick was not a difficult man to reach, as it turned out. He was the kind of man who had built something real over a long period of time, and was quietly aware that he had not figured out what happened to it after him. A problem that created a specific kind of receptiveness in people. I did not cold call him. Gerald made the introduction through a mutual contact in the Stamford financial community, framed as an investor inquiry from a qualified buyer. I sent a preliminary term sheet. Douglas asked for a meeting. We met at his office in Greenwich on a Wednesday morning in early December. He was a trim, deliberate man in a gray suit with a firm handshake and the careful eyes of someone who had made a career out of not being surprised. He looked at me across the conference table, 31 years old, a woman, arriving without a partner or an associate, carrying a single leather portfolio, and I saw him recalibrate once, briefly, before his expression settled back into neutral. I had seen that recalibration before. It no longer required a response from me. I walked him through my analysis. All of it: the capital structure, the debt service, the operational gap, the asset value versus implied value discrepancy, the three scenario models. I told him what I thought the company was worth and what I thought it could be worth under different management. I did not oversell. I did not perform confidence. I did not have. I simply showed him the work. He asked 3 questions. They were good questions. I answered all 3 without hesitation. At the end of the meeting, he said he would like to continue the conversation. We had 4 more meetings over the following 6 weeks. His attorney and Gerald exchanged documents. I brought in an independent auditor to verify the financials. The first tranche, 49%, closed in February, 11 months after I had sat in a hotel room in Norwalk, with 4 bags against the wall, making a list of what I had and what I needed. I did not tell anyone, not a colleague, not a friend, not Gerald's assistant, who had become a familiar voice on the phone. The acquisition was structured through a holding entity, Wardstone Capital LLC, a name I had chosen quietly, the kind of name that meant nothing to anyone who didn't already know, and the public-facing documentation contained my name only in the places legally required. I want to be precise about something, because I think it matters. I did not buy into Harwick Capital Group because of my mother. The business case was sound, and I would have pursued it, regardless of what her address was, or what name was on her building's management contract. I am a person who makes decisions based on analysis, not emotion, and the analysis was unambiguous, but I will not pretend I didn't notice. When I first pulled the full Harwick portfolio and cross-referenced the property addresses, the 4th line on the residential management list was Callaway Property Management, a subcontracted firm handling 22 of Harwick's residential properties, including 840 Long Ridge Road, Stamford, Connecticut, my mother's building. I sat with that information for a long time. I looked at it the way you look at something that confirms a thing you didn't know you suspected. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel angry. I felt, strangely, like my father was in the room, methodical and patient, and already several moves ahead. Richard Callaway ran Callaway Property Management as an independent contractor under a management services agreement with Harwick. The agreement was renewed annually. The current term expired in 14 months. I noted this in my model, in the column marked Operational Decisions, Pending. I moved on to the next line item. I had 1 more tranche to close before any of it mattered, and Douglas Harwick, in our 5th meeting, had begun to indicate, carefully, without committing, that he was open to discussing the path to full majority. I scheduled the 6th meeting for March. I did not rush. I had learned, from years of watching deals fall apart because someone pushed too soon, that timing was everything, that the most powerful position in any negotiation was the one where you could afford to wait, and the other party, eventually, could not. I could afford to wait. What I did not yet know was that my mother was about to make it considerably harder for me to stay patient. The call came on a Sunday. Not from my mother, from Preston. I had learned by that point to read Preston's calls the way you read weather patterns. He did not call to connect. He called when something was needed, and the something was always adjacent to money, and the money was always framed as something else first. Family, history, what our father would have wanted, before the actual ask arrived. I let it go to voicemail. I listened to the message an hour later while I was making dinner. His voice had the particular texture it got when he was performing casualness over something urgent, loose, slightly too warm, landing on certain words with a brightness that didn't belong there. He said he had been thinking about me. He hoped I was doing well. He said Mom had mentioned I was back on my feet, which was great, really great. Then he said he wanted to talk about something, just family stuff, nothing major, and could I call him back when I had a minute. I called him back after dinner because I wanted it done. He answered immediately, which told me he had been waiting. We exchanged 4 sentences of genuine small talk, the weather, a football score he mentioned that I had no opinion on, and then he moved into it with the practiced ease of a man who had done this particular thing many times before. He said he was in a tight spot, a temporary thing he was quick to add, a cash flow issue with a new venture he was building, a hospitality concept he called it, which I understood to mean a restaurant or a bar or something, in that category that Preston had decided was going to be different from the last 3 things he had tried out. He said he needed a short-term bridge, his word, bridge, of $80,000 to cover a gap between an investor commitment that was coming and some expenses that were due now. I listened to the whole thing before I said anything, Then I said, Preston, I'm not going to lend you $80,000. He said he wasn't asking me to lend it. He said he was asking me to invest. He would put it in writing, he said. A promissory note. He said the investors confirmed this was just a timing issue. He would have it back to me in 60 days. I said I understood what he was saying, and the answer was still no. There was a silence. Then he said, Gabrielle, come on. I said, I mean it kindly. No, another silence, longer this time. And then the shift, I had been waiting for it. Had known it was coming the way you know a weather front is turning, before the temperature actually drops. His voice changed. The warmth went out of it and something harder came in. He said, You know Mom used her own money to help you. When you were in school, she covered things for you. I said, She covered things that were paid for by Dad's accounts, which I now have documentation on. But I'm not going to argue about that, he said. I just think it would be nice if you remembered who was there for you. I said, I remember exactly who was there for me. That's actually a large part of why the answer is no. He hung up. I washed my dishes and went to bed. My mother called me the following Wednesday. I picked up because it was the first Sunday of the month call, 3 days early, which meant something had happened. Her voice had a particular quality I associated with decisions that had already been made. Clipped, preemptive, carrying the energy of a person who has rehearsed the conversation and intends to move through it on schedule. She said she had been thinking, and she felt that given how things had gone between us, I owed her an apology. I asked what specifically I was apologizing for. She said for leaving the way I did, for making things difficult, for not being more understanding of the fact that she had her own life and her own needs and could not be expected to put every on hold indefinitely for a daughter who had made choices that led to her being in that situation in the first place. I held the phone and looked out the window at the water. I said, I left because you put my bags in the hallway. She said that was not how she remembered it. I said that was fine, but it was how I remembered it, and it was what happened. She said I had always been like this. That I had always had to be right, always had to have the last word, always made everything harder than it needed to be. I said I wasn't trying to have the last word, I was trying to have an accurate one. She said Preston had told her about my refusal to help him. She said she found it disappointing. She said that in a family, people helped each other, and the fact that I had apparently come into some money. She said it exactly like that, come into some money, with a tone that attached quotation marks around the phrase without using them, and was choosing not to share it with my family said something about my character. I asked how she knew I had come into some money. There was a small pause. She said Gerald Fitch had reached out to her. I filed that away without reacting to it, though I made a note to call Gerald in the morning. I said, the money my father left me is mine. He left it to me specifically. I think you know why? Another silence. Longer, she said. I think this conversation is going nowhere. I said I agreed with that. She said she hoped I would think about what she had said and that she expected me to reach out when I was ready to have a real conversation. I said good night. I called Gerald the next morning. He was mortified. He had mentioned the trust in a condolence call to Diane 3 years prior, before I had come into it, in a moment of what he described as a lapse in professional judgment that he had regretted since. He apologized 3 times. I told him it was all right. What mattered now was the acquisition, and I needed to ensure that nothing in the trust documentation or the Wardstone capital structure was traceable to me through public filings before I was ready. Gerald confirmed it was airtight. Wardstone Capital LLC was held through a Delaware entity. My name did not appear in the operating agreement in any manner accessible through a standard search. The Harwick acquisition, in the publicly available record, showed only Wardstone as the acquiring party. I thanked him and hung up. 2 days later, I received a certified letter at my Norwalk address. It was from a law firm in Stamford I did not recognize. Pellegrino and Associates, 2 pages, formal letterhead. The letter stated that Diane Ward wished to recover certain educational expenses paid on my behalf between the years of my undergraduate enrollment and my MBA program, totaling, per their accounting, $112,000. The letter asserted these payments had been made as loans, not gifts, and requested acknowledgement of the debt and a proposed repayment schedule within 30 days. I read the letter twice. Then I scanned it and emailed it to Gerald with a single line. Please advise on the documentation. Gerald called me within the hour. He had pulled my father's financial records. Every payment made toward my education during those years had come from a joint account to which my father had been the primary contributor, and every transfer was documented in estate records as a gift disbursement, not a loan. There was no promissory note. There was no acknowledgement instrument. There was nothing in writing that could be construed as a lending agreement. Gerald said, in his careful way, that the letter had no legal merit and that a single response from his office would likely end the matter. He was right. Pellegrino and Associates did not write back, but I sat with the letter for a long time after that. Not because it frightened me. Because of what it represented. The particular quality of cruelty that requires planning, that requires picking up a phone and calling an attorney and dictating a demand with specific dollar amounts and certified mail instructions. My mother had not done that in a moment of anger. She had thought about it. She had decided to do it. I looked at my laptop. I looked at the Harwick Model L open in one tab and Douglas Harwick's last email in another, in which he had written, after our most recent meeting, that he was prepared to discuss the terms of the second tranche at my convenience. I wrote back that Thursday would work. I did not rush. But I was no longer in the mood to wait. Thursday's meeting with Douglas Harwick lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. I had prepared for it the way I prepared for everything that mattered, thoroughly, without leaving anything to assumption. The second tranche of documentation was ready before I walked in. Gerald had reviewed every line. The private credit facility was confirmed. The number we had been circling for 3 meetings. The price for the remaining 2% that would take me from 49 to 51, from significant minority to controlling majority, had been stress-tested against 4 different valuation scenarios and held up in all of them. Douglas Harwick was, as he had always been, a careful man. He asked his questions. His attorney asked her questions. I answered everything without consulting notes, because I had internalized the numbers the way my father had taught me. Not memorized, internalized, so that they were available the way your own address is available, without effort. At 11:47 in the morning, Douglas Harwick signed the transfer agreement. I shook his hand across the conference table. He held mine for a moment longer than necessary, and looked at me with an expression I had seen on older men before. Something between respect and a particular kind of wistfulness, the look of a person recognizing that a thing they built is going somewhere they did not entirely anticipate. He said, "Your father would be proud." He had known my father through the Stamford financial community, distantly, the way people in small professional circles know each other without being close. I said, "I know." I drove back to Norwalk. I sat at my desk. I looked at the water. Then I opened my laptop and I began the work of understanding, in complete detail, what I now owned. The full Harwick portfolio was 43 properties, 26 commercial, 17 residential. The residential properties were managed entirely through Callaway Property Management, under the services agreement I had first noted months earlier. The agreement that renewed annually, the current term of which now had 11 months remaining. Richard Callaway had held this contract for 9 years. It represented, according to the financials, approximately 38% of Callaway Property Management's total revenue. It was not a small number. I read the management services agreement carefully, all 41 pages. I noted the renewal provisions, the performance benchmarks, the termination clauses. I noted specifically the clause that allowed the property owner, now me, to conduct a formal operational review at any point during the contract term, with 60 days' notice. I sent a notice that afternoon, formal, professional, requesting a full operational review of Callaway Property Management's performance across all 17 residential properties in the Harwick portfolio. 60 days hence. Richard Callaway's office acknowledged receipt 2 days later. The tone of the acknowledgement was routine. He did not yet know who had sent it. Wardstone Capital LLC meant nothing to him. I intended to keep it that way for as long as possible. It was 3 weeks after the Harwick closing when my mother's first uninvited visit occurred. I had not given her my Norwalk address. She had, apparently, gotten it from Preston, who had gotten it from a cousin I had made the mistake of updating 18 months prior. I came home on a Tuesday evening to find her car, the silver Mercedes she had driven for 4 years, the one with the country club parking sticker, on the rear window, parked in the visitor space outside my building. She was sitting in the lobby. The building had a small lobby with a seating area and a security intercom. She had talked her way past the door. I never established exactly how, though I suspected she had told Hector she was my mother, which was true, and that she needed to wait. which was the kind of thing Hector in his retired schoolteacher kindness would not have questioned. I stopped when I saw her. I did not show surprise. I set my bag on my shoulder and walked to where she was sitting. She looked up at me with an expression that had been composed in advance. Not angry, something more complex. Wounded, but controlled. The expression of a woman who had decided to be the reasonable one in this conversation. She said, "I think we need to talk." I said, "You could have called." She said she had called. She said I hadn't been picking up, which was not accurate. I had picked up the last 2 times she had called and had conducted both conversations to their natural conclusions, but I did not correct her in the lobby. I took her upstairs. I offered her water. She looked around my apartment with an assessment. In her eyes she did not try to hide, taking in the size, the furnishings, the view of the water, and I watched her recalibrate my financial situation in real time based on what she saw. She sat at my kitchen table. She told me she was worried about Preston. The venture was in trouble, she said. The investor who had been committed had pulled back. She did not say why, though I had my suspicions about the quality of that commitment from the beginning. Preston was behind on rent for the commercial space he had leased for the restaurant concept. He needed $40,000 to cover the immediate obligations. She had already given him $60,000 from her own savings, she said. She couldn't give more without affecting her own stability. I listened to all of it, then I said, "I'm not going to give Preston money," she said. "Gabrielle," I said, "I've thought about it clearly and the answer is no. It's not about Preston personally. I don't invest in businesses without a viable model and a credible operator. That's not a judgment. It's a standard I apply to everything," she said. "He's your brother," I said. "I know who he is." She looked at me for a long moment. Then something shifted in her expression. The composed wound gave way to something sharper, something she had been holding behind the reasonable version of this conversation. She said, "You know what your problem is? You've always thought you were better than us. Your father did the same thing. Sat on money, kept score, made everyone feel small. You are exactly like him." She meant it as an insult. She did not understand that she had just given me the greatest compliment of my life. I said, "Thank you for coming by. I'll walk you out." She stood. She straightened her jacket. She walked to the door with the posture of a woman who has decided that the failure of this conversation belongs entirely to the other person. At the door, she turned and said, "Richard told me someone has been asking questions about his contract. Sending review notices. He's concerned." She looked at me with an expression that was measuring something. "Do you know anything about that?" I met her eyes. I said, "I hope he's been performing to benchmark. Those reviews are standard." She searched my face for a moment. She did not find what she was looking for, because I had spent 32 years learning not to leave things where she could find them. She left. I closed the door. I stood in my kitchen, and I thought about what she had just told me. That Richard Calloway had spoken to her about the review notice. That the first thing he had done upon receiving a formal operational notice from a property owner was call my mother. Not his attorney. Not his operations manager. My mother. I thought about Sandra at the Mimosa Tuesday, the look that had passed between Sandra and my mother when Diane had announced my unemployment to the room. The easy familiarity of a 9-year business relationship maintained through social proximity and mutual benefit. I opened my laptop. I pulled the Callaway operational review file I had already begun building. I added a new section. I titled it, Conflict of Interest, Management Relationships. I documented the connection between Richard Calloway and Diane Ward, the length of the relationship, the social overlap, the fact that Richard had disclosed the contents of a formal business communication to a third-party tenant rather than to legal counsel. It was not the most important thing in the file. But it was in the file. 3 weeks later, without any prompting from me, Preston made a decision that I would not have engineered if I had tried. He had been using his access to Richard Calloway. Through my mother's social connection, through years of Sunday dinners and charity events, and the particular ease that comes from being the golden child of a woman who lunched with someone's wife, to run what I could only describe, when I read the documentation later, as a referral scheme. Preston had been steering commercial tenants toward Callaway-managed properties in exchange for undisclosed payments. It was not sophisticated. It was the kind of scheme that works until someone looks at the pattern, at which point it becomes very obvious very quickly. Someone looked at the pattern, not me. A commercial tenant who had been referred to a Callaway-managed space paid a premium, and discovered the arrangement when a disgruntled Callaway employee left the company and took documentation with him. The tenant's attorney sent a demand letter to Callaway Property Management on a Tuesday in April. Richard Callaway called my mother that same day. My mother called Preston. Preston called me. I did not pick up. I was in Greenwich, sitting across from Gerald Fitch and a corporate attorney he had brought in from New Haven, reviewing the final documentation for the operational review presentation I had scheduled with Callaway Property Management's leadership team for the following month. The date of that meeting had already been set. All the relevant parties had already been invited. There was one name on the invitation list that none of them knew yet: mine. My mother called it a reconciliation dinner. That was the word she used when she left the voicemail. Reconciliation. As though the previous 14 months had been a misunderstanding between equals rather than a sustained campaign of financial pressure, certified legal letters, and uninvited appearances at my tuition. She said she wanted to bring the family together. She said life was short. She said Preston's had something he wanted to discuss with me directly, and she thought it would be better to do it face to face, in a warm environment, over a meal. She said she was making the lamb. I listened to the voicemail twice. Then I called Gerald. I told him my mother had invited me to a family dinner, and that I suspected the purpose was to pressure me into signing something related to my father's estate. Specifically, a document Preston had mentioned obliquely in a voicemail 3 weeks prior, something about clarifying the original intent of my father's trust. Gerald confirmed that any such document would have no legal standing, and that signing it would be entirely voluntary and entirely inadvisable. I said I understood that. Then I said I was going to go. Gerald was quiet for a moment. He said, "May I ask why?" I said, "Because I want to hear what they ask for. And because I want them in the same room when they find out I'm not going to give it." Gerald said, carefully, that he respected my judgment. I drove to Stamford on a Saturday evening in late April. The penthouse smelled the way it always had, a particular combination of the candles my mother burned and the faint, persistent scent of the leather sofa she had owned for 15 years. It was a smell that belonged to my childhood, and I had learned to experience it without nostalgia, the way you learn to handle things that were once warm and are no longer. Preston was already there when I arrived. He was standing in the kitchen with a glass of red wine, wearing a blazer he had not bothered to button, and he greeted me with the broad warmth of a man who needs something, and has decided that warmth is the fastest route to it. He hugged me. I let him. My mother emerged from the kitchen with oven mitts on her hands and a composed smile that had taken effort to assemble. She looked well. She always looked well. Diane Ward was a woman who maintained appearances with the dedication of someone who understood that appearances were structural, that they held things up. She said she was glad I came. I said the apartment looked nice. We sat down to dinner at 7. The lamb was good. My mother was an excellent cook. This had always been true, and I had always found it slightly inconvenient to acknowledge because it complicated the architecture of my feelings about her. We talked about neutral things for the first 40 minutes. A cousin's new baby. A renovation project at the country club. A film Preston had seen that he described at length without apparently noticing that neither of us had asked. I ate my dinner and I waited. The documents came out over dessert. Preston produced them from a leather portfolio he had set beside his chair at the start of the meal. I had noticed it when I arrived and had said nothing. He slid a folder across the table toward me with the careful casualness of a man who has rehearsed this moment and is trying to make it look unrehearsed. He said it was something Gerald had apparently overlooked in the original trust documentation. He said a family attorney, not Gerald, a different one, a man named Harlan that I had never heard of, had reviewed my father's estate and believed there was an argument that the trust had been structured without full disclosure to my mother, which potentially affected its validity. He said no one was trying to take anything from me. He said it was just about making sure everyone was treated fairly. He said the document was a simple acknowledgement that I recognized the potential dispute and agreed to enter into mediation. He slid a pen across the table alongside the folder. I looked at the folder. I looked at the pen. I looked at my mother, who was watching me with an expression of careful neutrality that had cost her something to maintain. I said, "Who is Harlan?" Preston said he was a Stamford attorney, a good one. He said Harlan had reviewed everything and was confident in the position. I said, "Preston, this document is asking me to acknowledge a legal dispute that doesn't exist. which would create one. He said I was being technical. I said, I am being accurate. My mother said, Gabrielle, we're not asking for much. We're asking you to sit down with someone neutral and have a conversation. That's all this is. I looked at her for a moment. Then I closed the folder and pushed it back across the table. I said, I'm not going to sign this, Preston said Gabrielle. I said, I mean it clearly and without ambiguity. I'm not going to sign it tonight. I'm not going to sign it after mediation, and I'm not going to sign it if you have Harlan send it to me by certified mail. The trust is valid. Gerald's documentation is complete. There is nothing to mediate. Preston's jaw tightened. My mother set down her dessert fork. She said, I want you to think about what you're doing. I said, I've thought about it. She said, you are burning every bridge in this family. I said, I didn't build these bridges, Mom. The silence that followed was the kind that settles into a room and doesn't leave quickly. Preston looked at the table. My mother looked at me with an expression I could not entirely read, part anger, part something older and more complicated, something that might have been, in a different life, grief. I folded my napkin and set it beside my plate. I thanked her for the lamb. I picked up my bag. At the door I turned and said, I'll see you both soon. At the Harwick Capital Group Operational Review. It's scheduled for the 14th. I believe you've both been invited. Preston looked up. His expression was blank in the way that precedes understanding, the face people make in the half-second before something lands. My mother said, What? I said, Have a good night. I drove back to Norwalk, and I called Gerald from the car. I told him I had not signed anything and that I had disclosed the meeting to the relevant parties. He said, How did they take it? I said, They didn't understand it yet, he said. They will on the 14th. I said, Yes, they will. I want to tell you what the 2 weeks between that dinner and the 14th looked like, because I think it matters. People sometimes imagine that the period before reveal is dramatic, that the person holding the information is vibrating with anticipation, running through the scene in their mind, savoring it. That was not what it felt like for me. What it felt like was work. I prepared the operational review presentation with the same attention I brought to everything. 47 slides covering all 17 residential properties, maintenance response times, vacancy rates, tenant complaint resolution records, cost per unit management fees versus market benchmarks. I had commissioned an independent property management assessment from a firm in Hartford. I had prepared a transition plan for Callaway's replacement, should the review conclude that replacement was warranted. I had also, quietly, in coordination with Gerald and the corporate attorney from New Haven, notified Douglas Harwick, now a minority stakeholder in his former company, retained on a consulting basis at his request, of the review findings in advance. He had reviewed the operational assessment and agreed, in writing, that the Callaway contract should not be renewed on its current terms. I had prepared a board resolution. It was signed before the 14th. The meeting was scheduled for 10 in the morning, in the main conference room at the Harwick Capital Group offices in Greenwich. The room had a long mahogany table, 12 chairs, and a wall of windows overlooking a courtyard. I had been in that room 8 times before. I knew where the light came from in the morning. On the evening of the 13th, I laid out what I was going to wear. A charcoal blazer, a white shirt, dark trousers. The same thing I wore to every meeting that mattered. Not a costume, not a performance, just the version of myself that walked into rooms prepared. I set my phone to silent. I went to sleep at 10:30. I did not lie awake running through the scene. I had done the work. The work was done. In 14 hours, everyone in that room was going to understand exactly what I had built, and exactly what it meant, and exactly why the woman they had watched carry 3 bags to an elevator 14 months ago had not in fact been diminished by the carrying. I slept well. I arrived at the Harwick Capital Group offices at 9:45. The building was a converted Victorian on a quiet street in Greenwich. Dark brick, white trim, the kind of address that communicated stability without ostentation. I had parked in the same spot I always used, the second space from the end, and I sat in my car for 3 minutes, not because I was nervous, but because I had learned, over years of walking into rooms where the outcome mattered, that 3 minutes of stillness before the door was worth more than any amount of rehearsal. I thought about my father. Not sentimentally, not the grief version of him, the one I visited on hard nights. The working version. The man who had sat at a kitchen table with a legal pad and taught me that a written list was just panic with structure. The man who had watched every school event from the back of the room and always had something specific to say afterward. The man who had written, in small, precise handwriting, on the first page of a letter I kept in my desk drawer, "Don't let them spend you down to nothing. You were always the one who knew what things were actually worth." I got out of the car. The conference room was on the second floor. I had arranged for Gerald and the corporate attorney, a woman named Christine Wald who wore reading glasses on a chain and had the unhurried confidence of someone who had never lost a case she considered important, to be present. They were already there when I arrived, seated on the far side of the table, coffee in front of them, paperwork aligned. Gerald looked up when I walked in. He gave me a small nod. I set my portfolio on the table at the head. I took off my blazer, hung it on the chair, and put it back on. Then I stood at the window and looked at the courtyard until I heard the elevator. The Callaway property management team arrived first. Richard Callaway came in ahead of his two senior managers, a man named Dave Ostrowski, who handled operations, and a woman named Terry Fung, who managed tenant relations. Richard was in his early 60s, heavy-set, silver-haired, with the comfortable authority of a man who had operated inside a favorable arrangement for 9 years and had not seriously considered the possibility of it ending. He shook hands with Gerald, nodded at Christine, and looked at the empty chair at the head of the table without asking who it belonged to. Dave and Terry found seats. Richard said, "Are we waiting on the ownership representative?" Christine said, "She'll be right in." Richard looked at the door. He looked at Gerald. His expression was professionally neutral, but I had learned to read the small adjustments people make when they are recalibrating. The slight tightening around the eyes, the particular quality of stillness that replaces natural movement when a person is holding something back. I was standing at the window. He had not looked toward the window yet. The elevator opened again. My mother came in first. She had dressed carefully. A cream blazer, her good pearls, the composed presentation of a woman who understood that her appearance was structural. She had been invited as a tenant representative, per the language in the meeting notice, which had been deliberately broad. She came in looking at Richard with the ease of long familiarity, and Richard looked back at her with something that was not quite ease. Something more careful, more watchful, the expression of a man who has recently received bad news and is not sure how much the person across the room knows about it. Preston came in behind her. He was wearing the same blazer from the reconciliation dinner, buttoned this time. He looked around the room with the assessing energy of a man who has been told to appear somewhere and has not entirely been told why. He saw Gerald. He saw Christine. He saw the corporate watermark on the documents stacked in front of Christine's chair. He sat down beside my mother without saying anything. I watched all of this from the window. Then Richard looked toward the window. I do not know exactly what he saw in those first 2 seconds. I know what I was doing, standing still, hands at my sides, looking directly at him. I know that his face moved through several things in rapid succession: recognition, confusion, the beginning of understanding. I walked to the head of the table and sat down. My mother had been speaking to Richard in a low voice. She stopped mid-sentence. She looked at the head of the table. She looked at me. She looked at the chair. She looked at the portfolio with the Wardstone Capital LLC letterhead visible on the top document. She said, "Gabrielle," not a greeting. A question, I said. "Good morning." I looked around the table. Richard, Dave, Terry, my mother, Preston, Gerald, Christine. I said, "Thank you all for being here. For those who don't know me in this context, my name is Gabrielle Ward. I am the majority shareholder and chief executive of Wardstone Capital LLC, which acquired controlling interest in Harwick Capital Group 14 months ago. I'll be conducting today's review." The room was very quiet. Richard Callaway set down his pen. Dave Ostrowski looked at Terry Fung. Terry looked at the table. Preston made a sound that was not quite a word, a short exhale, the kind that comes out when something hits before the brain has finished processing it. My mother did not make a sound. She sat with both hands flat on the table in front of her, and I watched the color leave her face in a way that was slow and complete, like watching a tide go out. She looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her before, not anger, not calculation, not the composed wound she had worn to my apartment. Something I can only describe as the particular shock of a person who has been operating on a set of assumptions for a very long time and has just been shown, without ambiguity, that every assumption was wrong. I opened my portfolio. I said, "I'd like to begin with the operational review findings. We'll take questions at the end." I walked through the presentation without rushing. 47 slides, 38 minutes. I covered every property, every benchmark, every area where Callaway's performance had fallen below the standards outlined in the Management Services Agreement. The maintenance response time data, the vacancy rate trends, the tenant complaint resolution records. The cost per unit management fees benchmarked against 4 comparable firms in Fairfield County. I presented the independent assessment from the Hartford firm. I presented the board resolution, already signed, regarding contract renewal. I was not unkind. I did not editorialize. I presented the findings the way I presented every finding, with specificity, without drama, in the measured tone of a person who has done the work and is simply reporting what the work shows. Richard interrupted twice. The first time to question the methodology of the independent assessment, which Christine addressed with 3 sentences and a citation to the contract clause that authorized it. The second time to suggest that the benchmark comparison was not appropriate given Callaway's specific operational model, which I addressed by displaying slide 31, which showed that the benchmarks had been selected in direct consultation with the performance standards written into the Management Services Agreement by Richard Callaway's own attorney in 2016. He did not interrupt a third time. When I reached the final slide, I said, based on the review findings and in accordance with the terms of the Management Services Agreement, Wardstone Capital has made the determination not to renew the Callaway contract upon its expiration. Written notice will be issued today. We will be transitioning management of all 17 residential properties to a new firm beginning on the contract end date. The transition plan has been prepared and will be shared with Callaway's operations team to facilitate an orderly handover. I closed my portfolio. Richard Callaway looked at the table for a long moment. Then he looked at my mother. My mother was still looking at me. I said, "I'll take questions now," Richard said. "How long have you owned this company?" I said. Wardstone acquired the initial position 14 months ago. Majority control closed approximately 11 months ago. He absorbed this. He said, "And you are Charles Ward's daughter?" I said, "Yes." He looked at my mother again. This time the look had an edge to it. Not warmth, not familiarity, something much cooler. I watched him understand in real time that the social network he had relied on, the 9 years of Sunday dinners and country club adjacency, and a contract that renewed because Diane Ward lunched with Sandra, had not protected him. Had not even seen this coming. Had in fact, by virtue of his decision to call my mother, rather than his attorney, when the operational review notice arrived, contributed actively to the record I had built. He said, "I'd like to discuss the transition timeline with my attorney." Christine slid a copy of the transition plan across the table. She said, "Of course. All relevant documentation is included," Preston said from his end of the table, in a voice that was quieter than I had ever heard from him. "Gabrielle, you own this building." "Mom's building." I looked at him. I said, "Wardstone Capital owns 43 properties in the Harwick portfolio, yes. Including this one, and the residential building at 840 Long Ridge Road." Preston looked at my mother. My mother was still looking at me. She had not moved her hands from the table. She had not said anything since she had spoken my name at the beginning of the meeting. Her face had not recovered its color. She said quietly, "Your father?" I said, "Yes," she said. "He planned this." I said, "He left me the tools. I built the plan." She looked at me for a very long time. I looked back at her. There was a great deal in that exchange that I will not describe here, because some of it belongs only to the two of us, the full weight of 32 years. The particular accounting that passes between a mother and a daughter who have arrived, through very different paths, at the same moment of reckoning. I did not feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that. I felt something quieter and more complicated. The particular stillness that comes when a thing you have carried for a very long time is finally set down. I said, "The meeting is concluded. Thank you all for your time." I closed my portfolio. I stood up. And the room for a long moment did not move. The room came back to life the way rooms do after a long silence, not all at once, but in pieces. Terry Fung gathered her documents quietly and efficiently, the practiced movement of a person who has learned to read the temperature of a room and respond to it without drawing attention. Dave Ostrowski followed her lead. They were employees, not principals, and they understood without being told that what had just happened was not about them, and that the fastest way through it was to be professionally invisible. Christine Wald was already on her phone. stepping toward the window with the focused calm of a woman who had a transition notice to file and preferred to begin immediately. Gerald caught my eye from across the table. He gave me the same small nod he had given me when I walked in. That was all. It was enough. Richard Calloway did not move. He sat at the table with his hands in front of him and his pen lying at an angle where he had set it down, and he looked at the transition plan. Christine had slid across the table with the expression of a man reading a document that is doing something to the shape of the next several years of his life. I had seen that expression before, not often, but in rooms like this, when the numbers on a page rearrange themselves into a reality that cannot be unrearranged. He said, without looking up, I want the full accounting of the performance benchmarks. Every data point, I said, it's in the appendix. Tab 4. He turned to tab 4. He read it. His jaw moved once slightly, the way jaws move when a person is working very hard not to say what they are thinking. Then he said, the referral arrangement with Preston Ward. I assume you know about that. The table went still in a different way. Preston looked up sharply. I said, I became aware of it. Yes, Richard said. I wanted on the record that I did not initiate that arrangement, and that when I understood the full scope of it, I moved to terminate it. He was speaking to Christine now, not to me. To the attorney with the reading glasses and the chain, the one who was still on her phone, but had turned back toward the table at the words referral arrangement. I have documentation of that termination and of my good faith attempt to remediate the affected tenant, Christine said without changing her expression. You'll want to share that with your own attorney. This meeting is a property management review. The referral matter is a separate legal question, Richard said. I understand that, Preston said Richard. Richard said don't, quietly, with finality, with the specific tone of a man who has decided that 9 years of Sunday dancers and country club adjacency has cost him enough and is now going to cost him nothing further. Preston closed his mouth. My mother had not moved. I watched her from the head of the table. She was sitting with the same stillness she had maintained since my name had landed in the room. Hands flat, back straight, face composed in the technical sense that it was not expressing anything identifiable, though the effort of that composure was visible if you knew where to look. I knew where to look. I had been looking at that face my entire life. She said, to no one in particular, I need some water, Terry Fung. Still present, still efficient, poured a glass from the carafe on the credenza, and set it in front of my mother without being asked. My mother looked at it. She did not pick it up. She said, to me, what happens to my apartment? I said, nothing changes for tenants. Lease terms, rent structures, and residency rights are unaffected by the management transition. You'll receive a letter within the week introducing the new management firm and explaining the transition process. She said, that's not what I mean. I said, I know. She looked at me with something that was working its way through the composure. Not anger, not the sharp thing she had reached for in my apartment, or over the phone, or across the reconciliation dinner table. Something older. Something that, in another version of our relationship, in a version where the past 32 years had been different, might have been called grief. She said, I didn't know he left you that much. I said, I know you didn't. She said, he should have told me. I said, he didn't trust you to let me keep it. The silence that followed was different from the earlier ones. Not the held-breath silence of a reveal. Something more interior, more private. The kind of silence that is not comfortable but is at least honest. Richard stood. He gathered his copy of the transition plan, his pen, the folder his attorney had prepared. He looked at my mother once, briefly, with an expression that had shed its warmth entirely and replaced it with the cool assessment of a man reviewing the terms of a relationship he was exiting. And then he looked at me. He said, Ms. Ward. A professional acknowledgement, nothing more. The kind you give to the person who holds the contract. I said, Mr. Calloway. He left. Dave Ostrowski and Terry Fung followed, Dave pausing at the door to collect a forgotten portfolio, both of them moving with the quiet efficiency of people who understood they were exiting a scene and not a meeting. The room was now 5 people. Gerald, Christine, me, my mother, Preston. Preston had been sitting in the particular stillness of a man who is calculating, running numbers, tracing lines of causality, working backward and forward through a sequence of events trying to find the point at which a different decision would have produced a different outcome. I had watched people do this in boardrooms before. It was never a quick process, and it never ended where the person hoped. He said, the referral thing, the tenant. I said, that's between you, Richard, and the tenant's attorney. He said, How much do you know? I said enough. He said Gabrielle. I said Preston. I'm not your attorney. I'm not your accountant, and I'm not going to tell you what to do. What I will tell you is that the tenant has documentation and Richard has already separated himself from the matter. I'd suggest you call someone today. He looked at the table. He looked at my mother. She was looking at her water glass. He said, Mom. She did not respond. He said, louder, Mom. She looked up at him. Something crossed her face. Not coldness exactly, but the particular expression of a woman who is seeing, perhaps for the first time, the full invoice for a long series of choices she had made about which child to protect and which child to require things of. It was not a comfortable expression. It was not meant to be. She said, call your attorney, Preston. He pushed back his chair. He stood. He looked at me once. And I want to be precise here because I think it matters, with something that was not anger, something closer to recognition. The look of a person who has just understood, fully, what they were looking at all along and simply had not seen it. He did not say anything. He picked up his jacket and he left. Gerald looked at me. I gave him a small nod. He and Christine gathered their materials and stepped into the hallway, closing the door behind them with the quiet discretion of professionals who understand the difference between what is business and what is not. My mother and I were alone. She picked up the water glass. She drank from it. She set it down. She said, how long have you been planning this? I said, I didn't plan it to hurt you. I planned it because the business case was sound and because Dad left me the tools to do it, she said. But you knew. When you were in this building. When you were signing things. You knew this building was in the portfolio, I said. Yes, she said, and you didn't tell me, I said. No. She looked at the table for a long moment. Then she said something I had not expected. She said, he always did this. Knew things and didn't tell me. Made decisions without telling me. Her voice was not angry. It was tired. I know you think that was because of me. Because of how I treated you. And maybe you're right, she looked up, but it still felt like being managed. By both of you. I sat with that for a moment. I did not dismiss it. I did not agree with all of it. I said, I think he was protecting something he worked very hard to build. And I think he knew, from experience, what happened to things in our family when they weren't protected. She said, that's a careful way of saying what you mean. I said, I'm a careful person. She almost smiled. It was a small thing, involuntary, and it was gone as quickly as it came. But it was there. Then her hand, which had been flat on the table, moved suddenly to her chest. A quick, grasping movement, the kind that is reflexive and not performed. Her breath changed. She made a sound that was short and sharp and involuntary. I was on my feet before I had decided to stand. I said, Mom? She said, She stopped. Her face had gone gray in a way that was different from the earlier pallor. Not shock, something physical. She pressed her hand harder against her chest and leaned forward slightly. I crossed to her side of the table. I put my hand on her back. I said her name again. She said quietly, I think I need to sit down, I said. You're sitting down, she said. I know. I called for Gerald through the door. He came in immediately. Christine called 911. I stayed beside my mother, with my hand on her back, feeling the effort of her breathing. And I talked to her in a low, even voice about nothing in particular. About the courtyard outside the window. About the color of the light. About the coffee that was still in the carafe, and whether she wanted any. Because I had learned, long ago, that what a frightened person needs most is not information, but the steady sound of another voice. The paramedics arrived in 11 minutes. It was not a heart attack. The attending physician at Greenwich Hospital used the phrase acute stress response with secondary hypertensive episode, which meant, in practical terms, that her blood pressure had spiked to a dangerous level and her body had responded accordingly. They kept her for 4 hours. They adjusted her medication. They told her she needed rest and reduced stress, which the attending said with the particular diplomacy of a person who has assessed the situation in the room and elected not to ask follow-up questions. I sat in the waiting area while they treated her. Gerald offered to stay. I told him to go. Christine had already left. I sat in a plastic chair under fluorescent light with my portfolio on my lap, and I thought about my father, and about the letter in my desk drawer, and about the particular cost of things that are built over a long time. Preston arrived at the hospital at 3 in the afternoon. He had clearly been crying, which I had not seen since we were children. He sat down next to me without speaking. We sat together for a while, without speaking. Then he said, I called an attorney. I said, good, he said. It's bad, I said. I know, he said. Gabrielle, he stopped. He started again. I'm sorry. For all of it. for the phone calls, for the document at dinner, for he stopped again. He looked at his hands, for not being there. When she put your bags in the hallway. I knew what she was doing and I didn't say anything. I looked at him. My brother, 4 years older, the golden child, the one who got the rules that bent, sitting in a plastic chair, under fluorescent light with his jacket crumpled on his lap, and his eyes red and his hands folded in his lap like a man who has arrived, late and disoriented, at an honest reckoning with himself. I said, I know you didn't, he said. That's not an excuse. I said, no. It's not. We sat for another hour, a nurse came out and told us my mother was stable and asking for both of us. We went in together. My mother looked smaller in the hospital bed. That is the thing no one tells you, that the people who have occupied the largest space in your life, the ones who have taken up room in you that you didn't consent to give, look smaller in hospital beds. The pearls were gone. The cream blazer was folded on the chair by the window. She was wearing a gown the color of old paper, and her hair had come loose from the arrangement she had constructed that morning, and she looked at us when we came in with the particular expression of a person who has been frightened and is not yet ready to stop being frightened, but is trying. Preston went to her first. He took her hand. She let him. She looked at me over his shoulder. I pulled the chair from beside the window and sat down. We did not have the conversation that evening. There was too much in the room. The monitors, the medication, the fluorescent quiet of a place designed to manage crisis rather than resolve it. We talked about small things, whether she was comfortable, whether she wanted the television on. A cousin's new baby again, which had come up at the reconciliation dinner, and now served as neutral ground we could all agree on. I stayed until 8. I drove home to Norwalk in the dark. I sat at my desk for a long time that night without opening my laptop. I looked at the water, which at night is just darkness with a particular quality of movement to it. I thought about my father's letter in the drawer. I thought about Douglas Harwick, who had built something over 30 years and had the wisdom to recognize when it was time to pass it. I thought about the look on my mother's face when the color went out of it in the conference room. Not the shock of exposure, but the older thing underneath it, the thing that might, in another version of our lives, have been grief. I did not feel victorious. I want to say that clearly. I felt the way I imagine you feel after carrying something very heavy for a very long time. Not euphoric, not relieved exactly, but aware suddenly of the absence of weight. And aware, too, that the absence of weight changes how you stand, changes what you are able to do with your hands. That is where the story, as a story of conflict, effectively ends. What happened after, what the months following that Thursday in Greenwich actually looked like, is the part I find harder to tell, because it does not resolve the way I think people expect. There is no clean reconciliation. There is no restored warmth. There is, instead, something more complicated and more honest than either of those things. Preston's situation with the referral scheme was, as he had said, bad. The tenant's attorney filed a civil complaint, Richard Calloway. Having separated himself early and provided documentation of his termination of the arrangement, settled quickly and quietly. Preston did not settle quickly. His attorney negotiated for 4 months. The final settlement required him to return the undisclosed payments, $43,000, and pay a portion of the tenant's legal fees. The restaurant concept folded before it opened. He moved into a smaller apartment in Bridgeport and took a salaried position with a commercial real estate firm in New Haven. An entry-level position, for a man in his mid-30s, which required a particular kind of humility I was not sure he possessed until he took it without complaint. He called me twice in those 4 months. Both times to talk, not to ask for anything. The conversations were short and careful, the way conversations are when two people are trying to figure out a new register for a relationship that has never operated in one. I do not know what we will become. I know that he sat next to me in a plastic chair under fluorescent light and cried and said I'm sorry without attaching a request to it. That is not nothing. I am choosing for now to treat it as a beginning. Richard Calloway lost the Harwick contract, as the board resolution had determined. Calloway Property Management, without 38% of its revenue, restructured significantly within 6 months. 2 of their 4 offices closed, 12 staff members were let go. Richard retained the company in reduced form. I have not spoken to him since the conference room. I don't anticipate that I will. The new management firm, Alderton Property Services, based in Westport, took over all 17 residential properties on the contract end date without incident. Tenant satisfaction scores across the portfolio improved by 22% in the first 6 months under Alderton's management, which I noted in the quarterly report to the Harwick board. With the same tone, I noted every metric. My mother was discharged from Greenwich Hospital the following morning with new medication and a cardiology follow-up scheduled for 2 weeks out. She went back to the penthouse at 840 Long Ridge Road, which she continued to lease at the same terms she had always had. I want to be clear about this. I did not change her lease terms. I did not raise her rent. I did not use the ownership to extract anything from her. That was never the point. The point was never to take from her what she had. The point was to demonstrate, to myself as much as to anyone, that what was mine could not be taken from me. We spoke on the phone 3 weeks after the hospital. It was not the first Sunday of the month. She called on a Wednesday, which was unusual, and when I picked up she was quiet for a moment, in a way that was different from her usual composure. Not performance, not preparation, just quiet. She said, "I've been thinking about what you said. About your father not trusting me to let you keep it." I said, "Okay," she said, "I don't think he was wrong." I sat with that for a moment. It was not an apology. It was not a full accounting. But it was an acknowledgement of a true thing stated plainly, without defense, by a woman who had spent 32 years defending her positions with the persistence of someone who understood that yielding ground meant losing something fundamental. That she had said it at all, that she had called on a Wednesday and said it without being asked, was something I had not anticipated. I said, "Thank you for saying that," she said. "I'm not good at this." I said, "I know." She said, "I'd like to try to be better at it." I said, "I'd like that too." We talked for 22 minutes. About the new cardiologist who she liked, about a book she had been reading, about a memory she had of my father, a small one, from early in their marriage, before the distance had settled in, that she offered without context, simply as something she had been thinking about. I listened to all of it. The calls are still once a month, mostly. Sometimes twice. They last longer now, 30 minutes, sometimes 40. They are not warm in the way I think she would like them to be, not yet, maybe not ever in the way she imagines. But they are honest in a way they have never been before, and I have decided that honesty is a better foundation than warmth that isn't real. 14 months after the conference room, Wardstone Capital Group. I had formally renamed the holding entity, consolidating Wardstone Capital LLC into a structure that reflected the full scope of what I was building, had expanded the portfolio to 61 properties across Fairfield and New Haven counties. I had brought on 2 senior analysts, both women, both in their late 20s, both the kind of person who kept receipts and asked questions and did not apologize for knowing what things were worth. I had moved out of the Norwalk studio. I bought a house, a small one, a 1920s colonial in Westport, with a kitchen that needed work, and a study with south-facing windows, and a backyard that backed up to a salt marsh. I put my father's photograph on the desk in the study, where the light was best in the morning. Gerald Fitch retired in the spring. We had a quiet lunch to market. Just the two of us at a restaurant in Stamford, good food and unhurried conversation. He told me my father had been, in his experience, one of the most methodical people he had ever worked with. He said my father had talked about me with a particular kind of quiet pride. Not the performative kind, not the kind that announces itself at dinner tables, but the kind that comes out in the way a person mentions someone's name. The steady, certain way. I thanked Gerald for 20 years of careful work. He said the thanks belonged to my father. I said I thought it belonged to both of them. I still drive past the penthouse at 840 Long Ridge Road sometimes, when I am in Stamford for a site visit or a meeting. I do not stop. I do not look up at the floor where she lives, but I know the building, its maintenance records, its vacancy rate, its tenant satisfaction scores, the way I know every property in the portfolio. Thoroughly, without sentiment, it is one of 61. It is also the one that started everything. I think about what my father wrote at the bottom of the first page of his letter, and I think it is the truest thing I have ever been told. You were always the one who knew what things were actually worth. I knew what I was worth. I just needed time and tools, and the particular patience of a person who has learned that the most powerful thing you can do with cruelty is refuse to become it. I built something real. Something that could not be thrown into a hallway in 3 bags, and I built it in silence, the way all the best things are built. Without announcing it, without performing it, without waiting for anyone's permission. That is the story I wanted you to have. There is something I want to leave you with. because I think it matters beyond the specifics of what happened to me. We teach women, quietly, in the particular ways that families teach things, through the rules that bend for some and don't for others, that being discarded is a verdict. That being thrown out, cut off, left behind, means something true about your value. It doesn't. The people who discard you are not the authorities on what you are worth. They are simply people who did not look carefully enough, or who looked and felt threatened by what they saw, which is a different problem entirely, theirs, not yours. What belongs to you cannot be thrown into a hallway. Build it carefully, protect it quietly. And when they finally understand what they were looking at all along, be standing at the head of the table, prepared. If this story meant something to you, if you have ever been thrown away by someone who should have been your safe place and had to build your life back in silence, tell me about it in the comments. I read everyone. And if you are somewhere in the middle of building, in the part that is hard and quiet and unglamorous, hit subscribe and stay close. There is more to tell.